The situation around Greenland continues to escalate rapidly, and more states are becoming drawn into an extremely dangerous game initiated by Donald Trump, the consequences of which are already going far beyond a single island. According to sources close to North American and European diplomatic circles, the crisis around Greenland is gradually transforming into a large-scale stress test for the entire Western security system, pulling in an ever wider range of players. One of the countries for which these developments have an existential significance is Canada. Relations between Ottawa and Washington have been in a state of extreme tension since Trump's return to power, and in Canadian political circles, this is no longer seen as a temporary disagreement. Donald Trump himself has repeatedly stated that he considers Canada an artificial entity and has openly called it the natural future state of the U.S., emphasizing that he is ready to use all available methods to achieve this goal, including forceful pressure. While these statements were previously perceived as rhetoric, against the backdrop of what is happening around Greenland, they are now being taken very differently in Ottawa. According to insiders, the Canadian government understands that Canada itself is not currently on the practical agenda of the White House, but Greenland is viewed by Trump as a testing ground. If a force-based scenario to incorporate Greenland proves successful and does not meet firm resistance from allies, this would amount to de facto permission for further revision of borders and spheres of influence, and Canada would automatically fall into the zone of next pressure. That is why the Canadian government led by Mark Carney views the situation as a direct threat to national security. In Ottawa, it is emphasized that a military annexation of Greenland would mean the final collapse of the old rules within which NATO and the entire Western world have existed. In such a reality, no treaties or allied commitments would be able to serve as guarantees, and the geography of U.S. pressure would continue to expand. Against this backdrop, Canada has taken an extremely firm position, expressing full solidarity with Denmark and declaring its readiness to support Europe in the face of threats from the Trump administration. According to sources, concrete steps are already following diplomatic statements. In closed discussions, the possibility of deploying a Canadian military contingent to Greenland as part of Allied support is being considered, with estimates ranging from several hundred troops to a much larger presence that, in an extreme scenario, could amount to tens of thousands of personnel. Officially, these measures are presented as defensive and aimed at stabilizing the situation, but in Washington they are perceived as a direct challenge. According to insiders, Donald Trump is furious at Ottawa's actions and sees them as an attempt to undermine American leadership in the Arctic. This only fuels further escalation and increases the risk that the situation will spiral out of control. Analysts stress that the game launched by Trump is becoming increasingly dangerous because it undermines the very foundations of the Western world, which until recently seemed monolithic and unshakable. Instead of consolidating in the face of real global threats, the West is being dragged into an internal conflict provoked by the decisions of a single individual. A security architecture built over decades is cracking, and allies are forced to prepare for scenarios that previously existed only in theory. And the further this crisis goes, the more obvious it becomes that its consequences may prove far broader than the fate of a single territory, turning Greenland into a starting point of a new and far more dangerous era. Against this backdrop, a formulation that until recently was considered taboo is increasingly being heard in Canadian strategic circles: preparation for the worst-case scenario. According to sources close to Canada's Ministry of National Defence and North American analytical centres, Ottawa understands that the crisis around Greenland has already gone beyond a diplomatic dispute and is gradually taking on the features of a systemic conflict in which the old rules no longer work. Canadian military and political planners proceed from the assumption that if the United States decides on a forceful seizure of Allied territory, this will become the point of final collapse of the entire logic of collective security. In such a world, Canada will no longer be able to rely on automatic guarantees and will be forced to act solely on the basis of its own survival interests. This is why, insiders say, defense doctrines have been revised at an accelerated pace in recent weeks, above all in the Arctic direction. This involves not only strengthening the military presence in the north, but also modernizing infrastructure, early warning systems, and logistical chains designed to ensure operational autonomy in the event of a potential crisis. At the same time, Canada is intensifying coordination with European partners, primarily Denmark, Norway, and France, building alternative channels of interaction that could function in the future, even if NATO weakens or fragments. In closed discussions, it is emphasized that this is not about an immediate withdrawal from the alliance, but for the first time in decades, a scenario is being acknowledged in which NATO ceases to be the central pillar of Canadian security. For Ottawa, this is a painful but increasingly realistic conclusion. Additional tension is created by the domestic reaction within Canadian society. According to sociological research and leaks from government structures, public opinion in Canada is shifting sharply toward support for a tougher and more independent foreign policy. Canadians increasingly perceive Donald Trump's statements not as eccentric rhetoric, but as a potential threat to the country's sovereignty. This creates political pressure on the government, forcing it to demonstrate readiness for decisive action. It is in this context that discussions about sending a military contingent to Greenland take on particular significance. For Canada, this is not so much about defending Denmark as it is about demonstrating a principle. An attempt at a forceful revision of borders in the Arctic will be met with resistance. In Washington, such signals are perceived extremely painfully. According to insiders, Trump's inner circle views Canada's actions as an undermining of American influence in the region and a dangerous example for other allies who might follow suit. This intensifies confrontational rhetoric and makes dialogue increasingly difficult. Analysts warn that if the situation continues to develop along its current trajectory, the world may face a paradoxical scenario in which the main lines of tension run not between traditional geopolitical adversaries, but within the Western Bloc itself. In that case, Greenland will become not merely a territorial dispute, but a symbol of the disintegration of the old world order. And the longer this escalation continues, the more obvious it becomes that the consequences of decisions made today will shape global politics for decades to come, regardless of how the current crisis ultimately ends. In this context, the conclusion is being voiced more and more often that the crisis around Greenland has become a catalyst for much deeper processes that had long been maturing within the Western world but had never surfaced. According to insiders, what is happening has become a moment of painful awakening for Canada. The previous model in which security and sovereignty were guaranteed through an unconditional alliance with the US can no longer be considered sustainable. Closed assessments emphasize that even if the current escalation is temporarily frozen, trust has already been undermined, and this means that Ottawa will be forced to continue acting on the basis of strategic autonomy. This implies not only strengthening the Arctic and expanding military capabilities, but also a rethinking of the entire foreign policy, including trade, energy, and technological ties. Analysts note that Canada is gradually preparing for a world in which it will have to balance between major centers of power without blindly relying on any one of them. And this is precisely the main effect of Trump's policy. Instead of strengthening American leadership, it pushes even the closest partners towards seeking alternatives and creating their own safety mechanisms. The longer the crisis around Greenland continues, the clearer it becomes that this is not a single conflict, but a turning point for an entire era in which former alliances cease to be self-evident and the world enters a phase of harsh and unpredictable restructuring, the consequences of which are only beginning to emerge.